publisher, and that deals off what has been called the biggest secret of World War II, the Japanese fire balloons, which Jackie and I heard about at a party many years ago and then decided to make a book about it. So, some interesting Baltimore connections. But we need to move on if I can do this. There we go. If things had been more fair. This is Steve Delkowski in 1961. And if things had gone out as everybody had planned, he would have probably, his statue might be in the memorial with like Earl Weaver and Palmer, Jim Palmer, the Robinsons at Camden Yards. But unfortunately it didn't. But in essence, his story is kind of intriguing because it kind of shows maybe, in a sense, the challenges, but also in essence kind of how maybe the perfect ending is different than we think it is. In 1963, Steve Delkowski was poised to come north with the Baltimore Orioles. He'd been working with Earl Weaver at their minor league team in Elmira. Weaver had straightened them out. Delkowski is still regarded as one of the top fireballer or fastball pitchers of all time. We don't know how fast he ever really quite threw because they tried to test him over at Aberdeen testing ground and he didn't throw the ball close enough to the target to really get any reading. Oh well. But as Weaver told me when I was putting together High Heat, he said they did IQ tests at Elmira back in that year. And ironically, Delkowski's roommate was Pat Gillick, who went on to become the general manager of both the Phillies and the Blue Jays and won championships with both. And of course, was the general manager with the Orioles and unfortunately did not win a championship there. Gillick's one of the smartest guys I've ever come across. He's, in a sense, the son of a film actress, single mom in Hollywood. You give him like a copy of the phone book, he can memorize it like that and repeat it. And to have him and Delkowski be roommates, which Weaver had done, is kind of borders upon the curious. And at one point, Weaver said, "I'm giving the whole team IQ test, Stanford Binet IQ test." And Gillick said, "Why?" And Weaver said, "I need to find out about one guy." And Gillick said, "I don't think it's me." No, they had to figure out Delkowski. And what they figured out was his IQ wasn't super high, and what the Orioles had been doing was just loading and loading more stuff on this poor guy. And so what Weaver said, we're going to do two pitches, fastball and a slider. And your fastball, you're not going to throw as fast as you want until we get two strikes. And when we get two strikes, I'm going to whistle. And when I whistle, you can throw it as fast as you want. And as Weaver said, Delkowski loved to hear the whistle. So Delkowski did great in '60 in Elmira. Looked like he was poised to make the team. There's his rookie card, even though he never quite makes it. But we'll get into that a little bit. But at this point in time, Delkowski seemed destined to kind of join this long line, a pantheon of pitchers throughout the game. Any sport has a number of people by position that you can just kind of recite through, and it tells you the history of it. And in many ways, Delkowski seemed destined to be the next great fireballer, the next great fastball pitcher. And one of the great things about fastball pitchers that I love is you can stand the ball up like a police lineup against the wall. There is no correlation between height, weight, whatever. It's not like basketball where it makes sense, I want to be a great basketball player, it makes sense to be tall. If you want to be a great football player, okay, be pretty muscular. There's no correlation. You have guys that are pretty big. You have other guys like Billy Wagner, who retired a couple years ago, who is shorter than me. And yet they can all throw greater than 100 miles an hour. Johnson was one of the first. His showdowns with Smokey Joe Wood in the 20s were showdowns for the ages. He pitched, obviously, just down the road in Washington for the Senators. And he didn't really win championships until kind of late in his career. His nickname's the Big Train. Big Train because it was the fastest mode of transportation when he was pitching. One thing I love, too, I'm going to do this. Look at his right arm. Looks a little bit longer than the left one, doesn't it? Interesting. One of the great things about Johnson is all these guys are curious about how hard they threw, how fast they could throw. they tell a great story of Johnson. Johnson threw like this. It was kind of a whip action. He could throw all day. And often, one time, won 3 games in 5 days, complete games each time. And Remington, the rifle company, was intrigued like anybody. How fast does this guy throw? He's the fastest of our era. And they said, come on up. Washington was playing in New York. They said, come on up to our factory in Connecticut. We'll pay for it. We'll get a test set up, and we'll see how fast you can throw. And then, of course, they could test projectiles and bullets and things like that. And they got up there, and of course, Johnson threw here, almost sidearm, just a little bit above. And somebody hadn't done their homework, and they had the test set up, so it was here, 3/4 delivery. And they couldn't change it around very quickly. And everybody's, oh, I'm sorry. And Johnson says, I don't throw that way. I throw here, not here. And everybody's apologetic and whatever. And Johnson felt bad. And he said, well, you've gone to all this time and set it up this way. I don't throw that way, but I'll give it a try. So he threw this way, so it's 3/4 delivery, was clocked at 95 miles an hour. Bob Feller believed Walter Johnson was the fastest of all time, which is saying something because Bob didn't really tend to put anybody second to him. One of the fun things about doing high heat, I was able to talk with Feller the last couple of years of his life, and Jackie sometimes would, I'd sometimes call him on the phone and, well, you're getting good Bob today or bad Bob? And sometimes bad Bob would be very cantankerous. But one of his best sayings was he never iced his arm. And you're looking at one of the top child prodigies in sports in this country. Before Tiger Woods, before Michelle Wie, before Wayne Gretzky, it was Bob Feller. He was so big that NBC Radio covered his high school graduation in Van Meter, Iowa. He was on the cover of Time magazine at the age of 18. I mean, he took the country by storm. Lost 4 years in the middle part of his career, practically the prime of it, to World War II. He was one of the very first Major League stars to volunteer for the war, served on a destroyer in the Navy, one of the last to come out. He did not take a cushy desk job like Joe DiMaggio and others. But one of Feller's best sayings was, ice, it's for drinks. He never iced his arm. And one of the last conversations we had was, and he said that again, and he was giving me a hard time about some stuff. Ice is for drinks. And I'm going, Bob, there's somebody who's playing right now who doesn't ice his arm. He's like, who? And I went, Tim Lincecum for the San Francisco Giants. And at that point, Lincecum had hair like down to here. And again, Lincecum was shorter than I am. Looks like a skateboard punk kid. And Feller goes, that guy? And I'm going, yeah. Tim Lincecum doesn't ice his arm either. And all of a sudden, Feller started warming up to Lincecum. He said, can you get me his number? And I've heard through other people that the last year of Feller's life, he had this improbable odd couple of Bob Feller and Tim Lincecum talking almost every other week on the telephone. Now, Feller was as curious as everybody else about how fast he threw, which hence brought some very curious situations. Up here, YouTube it, do Bob Feller motorcycle. This is the motorcycle test, the famous motorcycle test in Chicago. This is before he goes into, signs up for the Navy, where he throws against a motorcycle driven by one of Chicago's finest on a Harley Davidson. And you can see kind of 2 targets here. This isn't the best, but look at the footage, it's wild. And he's in street clothes. He's actually wearing wingtips. And they gave him a baseball, and they said, okay, when we say go, throw the ball as hard as you can at that target. You can see there's 2 targets. Both have 2 targets. And what they didn't tell him was, just before they said go, a Harley Davidson driven by the Chicago policeman was going to go roaring by him at 98.6 miles per hour. And in a sense, his ball, as he threw it, and they filmed it, would pass it and hit the target. Out of this Rube Goldbergian type of thing, they were able to decipher that on that day he threw 104 miles an hour. And you can also see in the footage, just before the motorcycle roars by, you can see kind of Feller flinch, and he says hitting that target he feels is one of the most difficult things he ever did with the motorcycle racing bike. A couple years later, he threw at this contraption that they borrowed again from Aberdeen testing grounds, and he did it before a game that the Indians were playing the Senators down at Old Griffith Park. This is one thing I loved about Bob. Calvin Griffith, the owner of the Senators, had been, in a sense, talking this up in the press for the whole week before. We're going to time Feller's fastball. He never cleared it with Bob Feller. So they went to Feller before the game and said, we're all set. I got this thing here. And Feller goes, you haven't talked to me about it. And Feller held out for $1,000 before he did. And he was timed that night at 107, kind of the average. The most remarkable thing was he went out and pitched that night, won, I think it was a 2-1 decision in 13 innings. You just go, that's Feller. Sandy Koufax. About the same time that Dalkowski is trying to make it, we're talking early 60s, this is one of the most amazing success stories in my mind. Because if you look at, in essence, Koufax's record, it's almost like they took two guys' stats and kind of shoved them together. His first 6 years, 7, weren't very good. He's below 500, ERAs through the roof, etc. Norm Sherry who then went on to become a coach with the Dodgers, was a catcher with the Dodgers, and he talks about how things can change in one day. And that's what happened with Koufax. The one day was spring training, 63, and the Dodgers are playing an away game. Koufax is the starting pitcher. Norm Sherry is the catcher. They've gone someplace else to play somebody. There's not a lot of guys who've gone along from Vero Beach to play in this game. And Sherry goes to Koufax, what are you going to do? What you thinking? He said, I'm going. Try all my breaking stuff, all my breaking pitches. Walks the first 2 batters. Sherry comes out to the mound and says, oh, that didn't work. What do you want to do now? He said, I know. I'm going to go, Koufax said, I'm going to go with the fastball. I'm going to go throw it as hard as I can. Watch the next guy in 4 pitches. Sherry comes out to the mound and says, this isn't working at all. And then it's hot out here. This is going to be a long game. I've got a suggestion, Sam. Take this, grain of salt if you want, but take a little bit off the fastball and try to hit my glove. Try to come close. Strikes out the side, pitches a shutout that day. Next day, a couple days later, the Dodgers are one. They had these things called string deals where you could adjust in a sense, the strike zone, and their pitchers would often throw down against these, warm up. And the next couple days, the word's gone around. Koufax has found control. The kid, who arguably was a better basketball player, has now seemed to embrace baseball. And they go down and they're watching him pitch to Sherry down in the string setup off the field, and he's pitching strikes. And the powers that be, which included Tommy Lasorda at that point, Walter Alston, they're going, whoa, this looks pretty good. And then Sherry says, I'll show you something better. He covered the plate with dirt, drew one line on the outside corner with his finger, another line on the inside corner. He started moving his glove from side to side, and Koufax was hitting it time after time. Look at his stats starting that year where he goes 18-3. This becomes the Sandy Koufax that we know with the 4 no-hitters, with Cy Youngs, etc. A guy who came on to somewhat duplicate or succeed Koufax in a lot of ways, certainly on anybody's short list for the fastest pitchers of all time. This is Nolan Ryan. This is him after his 4th no-hitter. Of course, he goes on to pitch 7 no-hitters. Ryan's a very interesting case in point because we tend to think of Ryan now as this guy who's on some pantheon of great pitchers. Tom Seaver talks about at one point, they're discussing Walter Johnson in the Mets dugout, and Nolan Ryan didn't know who Walter Johnson was. Seaver had to explain it to him. Ironically, many of Johnson's records, Ryan would go on to break. Ryan, though, I interviewed him several times for High Heat down at his ranch in Texas, and at first I wasn't getting it. He kept saying, "You don't know how close I came to quitting." And I went, "What? What?" This is a guy who came within 6 votes of unanimous selection of the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. And finally, I kind of started to tease it out with him. I said, "Nolan, what are you talking about?" In essence, this is the Ryan I think we all think of here. Why did you quit? Why did you almost quit? And he said, "I knew I had been given a gift and I wasn't doing right by it." And you don't know how much that eats up a person inside. And a lot of High Heat is about, I think we all have gifts. We're all given something. And in a sense, a life is, can you bring, in a sense, that gift to fruition? Certainly Ryan did. He did almost kind of a serendipity stroke of luck where he was traded to the Angels. You got to remember, he was traded from the Mets after they won in '69. One of the most amazing quotes I found for doing this book was Gil Hodges, then the manager of the Mets, saying after that trade, "I guess of all the good young pitchers I have," and he had many, Tom Seaver, Jerry Koosman, Tug McGraw, except Gary Gentry, goes on, "I guess Nolan Ryan is the one I can most afford to lose." And what you're seeing there is an organization that didn't know how to utilize him, how to bring him to his best. He fell in with a group in the Angels, got a regular turn in the rotation, and as they say, the rest is history. Whoops, I'll go back here with one more thing I wanted to show. Up here, 383 strikeouts season. That's another Johnson record that Ryan broke. Oops, I went the wrong way. There we go. Bob Gibson, another guy who arguably was a better basketball player than he was a baseball player. Played a couple years with the Harlem Globetrotters. Actually wanted to play college basketball at the University of, or Indiana University. He sent a letter, said, "Would you please check me out? I think I'm pretty good." Got a reply saying, "Sorry, we've already got our one black player on the team already." Kind of before that. He's a guy that, in my book, Summer of '68, and in talking with Tim McCarver, who caught him, I had a lot of fun kind of seeing, in a sense, the mental gymnastics or philosophy somebody will go through. In 1968, which obviously was a traumatic year, we had the assassinations of Dr. King, we had the assassinations of Bobby Kennedy, we had the riots on the streets, etc. Gibson didn't get off to the best of starts. Don Drysdale that year had the long scoreless streak that Oral Hershiser breaks later on. He had Catfish Hunter pitching a perfect game for this new team in Oakland, the Athletics that had just moved from Kansas City. It wasn't like Gibson was stinking it up, but he wasn't among the elite. Yet, after they assassinated Bobby Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, there's a great line that Gibson said. He said, "I was, in a sense, sad, distraught when they shot Dr. King. I became infuriated when they killed Bobby Kennedy." And he was somehow able to channel that anger, angst, disgust with the country almost as overall into his next start. If you look at old footage of the '68 season, and Carver would walk through me with it, he's spending 10 to 11 to 12 to maybe 14 seconds between pitches. That's how fast he's working. Looks like a man on fire. He pitches his first shutout of that season in his first start after Kennedy's death. Goes on to pitch 13 shutouts, 28 complete games, an earned run average of 1.12. These are stats you're not going to see again, people. For much of the season, his ERA was below 1. And it was all because he took what was around him, as a black man in a country that was being kind of pulled apart, and channeled it into, in a sense, what he could do. It's ironic. I think of him now more than anything in the last couple of weeks with all the stuff from Ferguson. You got many fireballers today. Here's Strasburg from down the road when he's still at San Diego State. You've got certainly David Price. You got Aroldis Chapman with Cincinnati. I love watching these guys because I kind of put the Ryan kind of denominator on them a little bit. Ryan, when Nolan Ryan and I were talking, he said what the misconception is, people think this is so easy. It's not easy. In a sense, you can almost see from the get-go in kids' games and such, who can throw faster, who can do this better. And somehow we think it's easy for them. If anything, it becomes more challenging. And I love watching Strasburg, who has been up and down like others. Can they, again, take this gift of something, of being able to throw a fastball very fast and make it into something that's bigger than them? It's pretty rare. If you look back at the great fireballers going back to even the turn of the last century, there's almost as many flameouts as there are success stories. And it's an interesting way to make kind of look at the season. I was going to get back to Delkowski. You guys are all worried. All right. Poor Steve. But things turn out. Steve Delkowski has been fitted for a big league uniform in 1961. He's going north with the team. He's making his last spring training start. Things look good when he feels something pop in his left elbow. Doesn't sound good. He will never be the same as a pitcher. And he will start kind of this downward spiral that it took a long time to come out of. He tore, in a sense, the ligament in the elbow, which is done almost all the time, then and now. Unfortunately, today, everybody's got this poster child. Tommy John. And there's the incision right there. There's the scar. When they started Tommy John surgery, Tommy John asked Dr. Job, who was the team doctor for the Dodgers, okay, we're going to take a ligament out of another part of my body, usually the hip, and we're going to attach it to the elbow, and we're going to knot it through and really torque it up. What's the chances of success for this? Remember, John's the first one. And Job, to his credit, said, percentages are very low. We've got 1 to 2% chance that you'll ever pitch again. John, like many baseball players, said, sounds good to me. I'm game. Because I love this game. But one of the great stories with John, and I had a couple discussions with him, is, and I'm among doctors here, so I got to be careful, nerves grow back very slowly. And one of the things they told him was, you're going to have to be patient. And in a sense, almost as soon as he was out of surgery, he was trying to throw, his wife was catching him, that was a mess. And he kept being a part of the team. This is the Dodgers in LA. His own teammates were like going, why are you still here? You're damaged goods. Nobody's ever come back from this surgery. I mean, get out of here. But he kept coming. He would chart pitches. He would do his rehab. And John talks about this one day. He's driving to the ballpark, and he's got two hands on the steering wheel. And his left hand, he was another lefty, it was like a claw at that point. And he used to have to bring it and put it on here and put the fingers down and do whatever needed to be done. And he's driving to the ballpark, and all of a sudden he could see the little finger come up a bit. And at that point he said, I'm going to make it. And he came back and pitched another 10 years in the major leagues. Unfortunately, Steve Delkowski didn't have Tommy John surgery at that point. I've run into kids now who are 17 or 18, they're on their second or third Tommy John surgery. Wow. In part because they feel they're faster after they get it, which is a little bit on the side. But unfortunately, it didn't help Steve. And Delkowski at that point had pretty much left baseball. And one of the most bizarre stories I can ever come up with. He became a migrant worker in the Imperial Valley in California. He also became an alcoholic. He was the only, he said later, the only Polish migrant worker out there for a while. One way he would help himself work pretty quickly is he put bottles of cheap white port at the end of rows, and he'd go for it. Incentive. Very much incentive. Not a good incentive to have, but that was his incentive. And from there, he married That didn't work out. He flamed out, remarried. That didn't work out. And it goes to a point where it's 1992 and he's homeless and he's in LA and he comes into a laundromat on New Year's Day and there's a Hispanic couple there doing their laundry. It's New Year's Day, so there's not going to be a ton of people doing their laundry. And they realize this guy's in trouble. I mean, this is where good Samaritans come in. And they cobble out enough out of him that, in a sense, they find out that he grew up in New Britain, Connecticut, that he doesn't have a home, that he's penniless. In a sense, he's been living on the street at that point for close to 2 years. And they somehow are able to reach back and get a hold of his family, notably his sister, Pat Kane, back in New Britain. And he goes back home. And the story lives on because the Nuke LaLoosh character in Bull Durham is based on Delkowski. Some people, I love that movie. I saw it again the other night. It's funny how things kind of come around. The reason, and this is obviously Nuke here, Crash Davis, Susan Sarandon. Ron Shelton, who goes on to become a prominent movie writer, director in Hollywood, used to play in the Orioles organization. He never made the major league team, but he played in the minor leagues. He never played with Delkowski, but he heard all the stories. Many of the stories made it into the film. Hitting the mascot with a pitch, throwing one over the top of the backstop that ends up hitting the announcer. One that you throw a pitch so hard it goes through a fence. At one point I asked Delkowski, I said, did all that happen? And he said, yes. And we're just like going down through this checklist. I hit the mascot, I threw one through a fence. And then finally at one point he said, but Tim, there's something that happened in the movie that didn't happen to me. I'm going, what's that, Steve? And he said, I never got a date with that lovely lady. So thanks to Ron Shelton, who kind of kept the story of Delkowski going. And there's certain asides or nods in the movie to Delkowski. When Nuke is called up to the show or called up to the major leagues, they have this very quick set piece where two guys are loading this car and they're going, man, he was great. Yeah, he was really good. And how good was he? And they say, in a sense, well, he struck out 262 and he walked 262. That's exactly Steve Delkowski's line in 1960 for Class C Stockton, California. So it kind of lives on. And so does Delkowski. This is Steve at a reunion of prominent sports stars from New Britain. And New Britain has had many different sports. That's him in the middle, flanked by either side by his high school pitchers and his best friend of all time. There's one there. Len Perry here tells a great story about catching Delkowski in high school, where, in a sense, you never knew where the ball was going. One point, Len Perry said, I had to jump up like this to catch the ball because I just rose. But, and his hand's getting kind of beat up. And again, this isn't medically correct, but he makes for a good story. His hand's getting beat up, and he goes to the adults or the parents in his life and says, I'm having to catch this guy. This throw is really hard, and my hand's getting all beat up. And the adults say, get some beef on it. Slap some stuff on like that on it, toughen up your hand. So he goes down to the local butcher, gets a couple slices of beef, and he has them cut thin. The kid's thinking, Len Perry was a smart guy, still is a smart guy. Next game, he's got to catch Delkowski. He puts one of the thin slices of beef up inside his glove. He starts catching. By the second or third inning, he's catching him, ball's hitting, you're getting some blood down his forearm. And as Delkowski said, that was the best game I ever threw. And the opposing batters are starting to see it. This guy's really hard. Look what he's doing to his own teammate. And they would just kind of come in and just shake the bat and get out of there. He said, I wish we kept doing that. Delkowski did come back to Baltimore in 2003. I love symmetry. Ended up throwing out the first pitch for an Orioles game. And among his friends who were there were Boog Powell and Pat Gillick, his old roommate, who came down. What's interesting now is if you visit Steve, Steve's memory is, alcohol just beat him up, but good. But the memory's coming back. They tell a great story where his old high school coach was taking him to church Sundays, and I believe Coach Huber was Methodist or something like that. And one day they were halfway to church, and all of a sudden Steve goes, "Stop the car." And she was, "Okay, what's the problem?" And Delkowski goes, "I just remembered I was raised Catholic." Anytime I'm up in Connecticut, I try to stop by and see Steve. And one of the strange things, or not so strange, he now lives in a convalescent home, which is kind of on top of a hill that overlooks the main park in New Britain. And from his window, almost, you can see the pitching mound on the field where he used to play. You can see the outfield, but you can't quite see the pitching mound. I'm going to stop there and take some questions if you guys want to have it. Go ahead.
Did you ever interview J.R. Richard?
I did not interview J.R. Richard. I wish I had. I interviewed his general manager and some other folks. J.R. Richard, for those of you that know, pretty much suffered a stroke while pitching. In one of the instances where, in an odd way, it helped out Ryan because they were contemporaries on that Astros team. And what the team had been doing was they kept somewhat testing J.R. Richard and saying, "No, I think you're fine. I think it might be in your head." And in a sense, he wasn't feeling right. He was feeling dizzy. He was feeling, shortness of breath. And then they actually held in a sense, a stiffness simulated game for him, and that's where he suffered the stroke. And Ryan pretty much felt that after that, he would never trust team doctors again. He would always get, in a sense, a second opinion, this type of deal. Because he realized after what they had done to J.R. Richard, in a sense, at least the medical people with the team might not have my, best interests at heart. And it's interesting because I think Ryan, among all the pitchers, probably took care of himself the best. There's only been 2 pitchers, if you look at velocities and such and really grade it out, you really get the numbers. Ryan is probably the only pitcher after probably the age of 32, 33 who maintains velocity. One other pitcher goes up. Clemens. Because of steroids. So
some people felt that J.R. Richard was a little faster than Ryan. That's the only reason I brought it up.
Yeah, I think J.R. Richard potentially was at his height, maybe faster. So, yeah. Joe?
Did you ever interview Satchel Paige?
I did interview Satchel, but I talked with Feller about Satchel. And they were very good friends. And it's funny because I think in some ways Feller, especially in his later years, he didn't, how can I say, he was his own worst enemy sometimes. I mean, Bob would very much speak what was on his mind, and he got into trouble for saying, in a sense, saying Jackie Robinson maybe wasn't the player that people said he was. In a sense, what he was trying to say is Jackie Robinson wasn't the best African-American baseball player, but obviously they chose him, because of other reasons, temperament, ability to turn the other cheek. Satchel potentially would have been the best, and I think Feller felt Satchel got passed over in some ways. One of the things I love, a friend of mine, Tim Gay, did a great book on Satchel Paige and Bob Feller and kind of their friendship. And Feller always liked to make a buck, okay? And you knew that from him negotiating with Griffin before he pitches in front of that machine. But he'd also look out for his friends. And he knew the African ball players, certainly before Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier and even afterwards, weren't making out very well. And in the off-season, Bob Feller was one of the first to get his pilot's license, got his own plane, then got another plane, and he would fly around the country, not just his all-star team, but they would always play this other all-star team, which had Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, all these guys on it, and he'd fly them around. And he'd do it in part because it was good, it would make for good money, but also too, he did it in a way because he felt his friend Satchel wasn't making out. And, Satchel Paige doesn't break into the major leagues till 48, and that's kind of sketchy. He may have been 50, and, did pretty well. What else? Right here.
When a fastball pitcher like Johnson
Mm-hmm.
delivers other than a fastball, is his delivery different?
No.
The batter can't tell what's going to come.
No, the key is you don't want the batter to know what's coming. And sometimes when you hear somebody's tipping their pitches, you'll see a slight difference. They may pat the glove like once. The arm angle may be a little bit different. But I think and the thing is, you have to have another pitch too. You've got to have a slider or something that's a little bit slower, because what makes a successful pitcher is that variation or that difference in velocity. And you hear scouts talk about, I love hanging with scouts, and because I learn a lot, and they're fun, and they're cantankerous, and they're kind of crazy. But they always talk about range. Okay, what's the guy's range? And in a sense, the range would be how fast the fastball would be, and if the range can be 8 miles an hour or more between the pitches, then you're looking good. Because in a sense, the batter doesn't know what's coming. And you cannot adjust, quickly enough. If you're expecting something at 97, and here comes a slider at 90, 89, especially if you have location, then you're in good shape. So the really good scouts, that's what they look at. And that's one reason they have, almost every pitch, they're marking it with their radar guns. Even though some people think we're so definitive now on velocity, I think, if anything, we're all messed up more in velocity. Meaning, I remember seeing with a bunch of scouts, had to almost be a dozen of them. And this was down in Durham, because part of High Heat does a nice riff, I think, on Bull Durham. David Price, who's a character in it, was then at AAA, and David's an amazing story. And I'm sitting with all these scouts, and it wasn't David, somebody else was throwing, and all of a sudden the ball came in pretty quick. And I just yelled out, "What do we got for that?" In a sense, they're marking every pitch. They're clocking every one. The guy next to me had 92. The guy down here had 94. The guy over here had 89. The guy here had some other number. They're all using the same make of gun, serial stalker radar gun. And at that point I went, this is kind of a house of cards, isn't it? And I think whether you go to Camden or, Nance Park down in D.C. or wherever you go, when you see the velocity, I think they're dialing it up to make us all go, ooh, ah, too. Right here.
Okay, I have a question, because I know you talked about like Bob Feller throwing 107.
Mm-hmm.
What's the fastest pitches now?
Well, supposedly Chapman has been clocked at, now that's radar gun, and maybe that's more definitive than throwing against a motorcycle or something. He's been clocked at 105 or 106. Nolan Ryan threw against an infrared something or other and was clocked at 102. So it's all, I think this is one of the fun things, I find it fun, other people maybe don't, is you cannot be definitive. In a sense, our technology isn't going to save us at this point.
Right.
And I think that's what still keeps somebody like a Walter Johnson or Smokey Joe Wood or a Feller or anybody like that still somewhat in the equation, because I don't think radar guns and stuff today are definitive. The kid right now who pitches relief, Arados Chapman, the Cuban defector, he's somewhat recognized as being the fastest in the game. Go ahead.
Who would you say was the most dangerous pitcher against the batters because of his fastball and his lack of control?
Well, a number of them. Ryan certainly comes to the list, and I think Ryan kind of played that up to a certain degree. The smart ones did. God, I'm drawing a blank right now. He pitched for the Yankees. I'm drawing a blank. But one of his last pitches, he would come in relief, and actually he had pretty good control.
Gossage.
Yeah, it was before Gossage. But anyway, his last one, he would throw it to the screen. And he and the catcher had this all set up. They go, I'm going to throw it high. I'm not going to throw it super high. Don't try to catch it. And you always have the next batter like looking in there, okay, what's he? Hey! And so I think the good ones played that up. And several batters or former hitters told me, they said, you hated to be hit by Ryan because, number one, you weren't quite sure where it was going. And unlike Delkowski, his ball, when it hit you, it in a sense, within the neck, it was a heavy ball. I mean, it just kind of stung.
I remember Ryan with the Mets. You never knew what was going to happen.
No, well, especially with the Mets, because it was the Mets didn't coach him. I mean, one of the things I find mind-boggling is he and I walked through this. Well, I'll show you. And one of the things you can watch it with kids is where things are kind of out of whack. Is everything should be in line, so to speak, in a movement like this. And so you kind of come out, and this foot plants. It should be square with the shoulder, square with the arm, and everything's in one line. Okay. One reason Ryan was so wild with the Mets is when he was throwing for them, that lead foot would come out just a smidge. It wouldn't be here, it would be here. Okay? I don't feel like I'm dancing up here. But it would be off by that much. And that meant it opened up here, and everything got a little funky. And he said one of the first things the Angels did, they had a great pitching coach there called Tom Morgan, old timer, great guy. And he said, and you watch Ryan pitch, in the bullpen, maybe just a couple minutes, he said, stop. And Morgan stood right here. And he said, pitch again. And now Ryan couldn't turn because he'd hit Morgan. And all of a sudden it was here. And almost immediately, everyone went, ooh, that's a lot better. And away it went. So, I want to show you one last picture, maybe we can talk about it. There's an old one. That's actually Fidel Castro, who one of my books deals with the novel, What If He Pursued Baseball as Opposed to Revolution? And we do know he did pitch. And he was a very good pitcher. Coming out of high school, he'd been a blue chip prospect, that type of thing. And at age 21, he had to kind of decide. And it's funny, after Curveball came out, I suddenly got all this mail from people going, yeah, my dad used to play in the Winter Ball League down there. Actually, Brooks Robinson used to play in the Winter Ball League down there. I didn't hear from him. But yeah, but Fidel Castro would pitch batting practice for us. I remember, my granddad remembers him. My great-grandfather remembers him, whatever it would be. So you can tell I've got an infatuation at times with pitchers. Go ahead.
How much of the success of a pitcher depends on who's catching for him?
A ton. Catchers, I think, are the unsung heroes of baseball in a way. Some of my best friends through the years, like Coach Ryan, guys like that, have been former catchers. And I think they just see everything and they have to be a part of everything. And I find it very intriguing that they get so beat up and they're so unsung, and yet they have to know, they have to kind of know the pitcher better than the pitcher knows himself. Years ago, I did it was with Tony Pena, who was then with Boston, I believe, and Tony's now, coach with the Yankees. And we set it up where I caught up with Tony over 3 games. They were in Chicago, and he caught a rookie, a journeyman, and a potential Hall of Famer, because one of them was Clemens, in 3 days. And then he sat down with me for like more than an hour after each game. I mean, we also talked before the game, and I would just very meticulously, kind of grade it out more than I usually do. Pitches, what was the big pitch, whatever. And he was great, because he would just say, okay, 3-2 pitch in the 4th, we got 2 men on, and I'm trying to do this. And what struck me was you had 3 very different types of pitchers in different parts of their careers, in different parts of their confidence levels, self-esteem, whatever it would be. It was amazing how different he had to be each game. I mean, and he knew it. The rookie, okay, and I even kept track. I think he went out to the mound like 6-7 times. The journeyman, okay, we got beat up last time, but we'll stay away from that pitch. And it's amazing how much work he went into it. So I think a lot of I think kind of one reason Strasburg, for example, hasn't developed that much. I keep waiting for him. It's changed a little bit this season. I keep waiting for him to click with a certain catcher. And you look at the old Braves teams with Schmaltz and Maddox and Glavine. I mean, they all had certain catchers they were on the same wavelength with. And it's funny. Catching's actually in curveball, the major protagonist, it's a first-person narration. It's from the viewpoint of a catcher with that team. In part because I think catching, you hear a lot, that kind of viewpoint, it's God's view of baseball. Everything's laid out in front of you. Whereas every other position, you're kind of, I'm over here. So years ago, I was in Hollywood and we're doing, we're chatting up curveball, because they've been optioned, and I took a director to Dodger game. A bunch of us went, and he'd never been to a ball game. So here I am trying to explain baseball to him, and that was a mess. And about the fourth, fifth inning, though, he goes, I got it. I go, I don't know what you got. So I think I'm totally confused. And he said, but it was very eloquent and very kind of fit into the catcher's viewpoint a little bit. He said, he kind of dismissed the outfield, not doing that. But he said, what that whole kind of area there, where you got that kind of dirt and you got the grass. I'm going, yeah, infield. He goes, infield. It's kind of like a stage, isn't it? I go, yeah. And he goes, and that guy standing on that bump, the pitcher. Yeah, the pitcher. He's kind of like the guy who starts everything. He's like the narrator or the everyman. I'm going, whoa, okay, nice. That was an interesting day.
Right.
Somebody mentioned earlier that you had covered the America's Cup, and I realize this is a gross deviation from
No, go ahead.
But I'd be interested, it's very, very different to cover that sport than
No,
baseball.
it's not.
All right. Would you talk about that a little bit? What years did you cover it?
I only covered it a couple years, but I got one of my best assignments out of it. Went to Perth, Australia for, I don't know, a month, 5 weeks. Yeah, I'll do that. But I think it's like anything. You find the great characters. And, if you get into the minutia and get into the tactics, you can bore somebody with yachting stuff just as much as you can bore somebody with baseball stuff, probably. But the characters, I was fortunate. The characters are great at that point in time. We were talking Dennis Conner, and I was over there covering the San Francisco boat, which had Tom Blackhaller. Still one of my favorite stories. I was with them. I don't know what I was doing on board. But I was on board, and they're doing they always would practice in the bay, in San Francisco Bay, which made no sense.
Were these 12-meter boats?
Yes, those are 12 meters. And they were racing off Crissy Field in San Francisco, which is a big thing for windsurfers. And they're just going right through them and all this. And somebody on one of the windsurfers ditched or fell or something, kind of out in front of them. And he kind of came up out of the water and was hanging onto his surfboard or board, and he just kind of froze because then he had this 12-meter kind of bearing down on him, and he had plenty of time to get away, but he just got like this, and it's kind of coming down. And Blackhaller was at the wheel; he was the skipper, and Blackhaller, being Blackhaller, would I think he was a pirate in another life, was just like bearing down on him like this. He wasn't cutting this guy any slack. And then at the very, very last minute, he spun the wheel one way and spun it another and went like this. And they went around this guy, cut it very close. And then over the back transom, Blackhaller yells out, "Were you scared?" I mean, that guy was great copy. You're just sitting there like, this is nuts. So we're going to put knives in our teeth and we're going to go board something here in a minute. So I don't know. I think anything like that, if you have good characters, then you try to find them. One more? Joe?
Is there, speaking of catchers, what about the correlation for pitchers to their pitching coaches? 'Cause, the Orioles, for years and years, had great pitching and also had a string of outstanding pitching coaches. I mean, have you looked at how those influence, like you said, if Nolan Ryan had stayed at the Mets, he may never have developed.
Right. I think what people, it's funny, as the money's gone up, one thing that's been forgotten is how fragile the mental state for a lot of these guys are, especially pitchers. Pitchers they're hypochondriacs. I've yet to really run into kind of a normal pitcher. And maybe that's one reason I like chatting with them so much. I mean, even Palmer's great, but there's certain things you say, really? You know, I don't quite get that. And so they need somebody to confide in, and I find it amazing with all the stuff about pitch counts and money and such that more the organizations don't try to, in a sense, dial in and get people that can really identify with these guys. I think there's beginning to be another sea change that way. And I think it's been difficult, in essence, for kind of newer or older coaches to identify with the newer players, because the money has expanded so much. I mean, that's why I give Buck Showalter so much credit, because I think to motivate, he's going to be working hard next year. You know, to motivate players these days when you're making so much less than them, that's tough. And yet, you know, what I've seen out of the Orioles the last couple of years is very much, you know, a Buck team, and I've known Buck for years. I mean, you know, it's funny, Buck comes across so hardcore and whatever, but underneath he's a really funny guy. But you're never going to get a glimmer of that on that team. So it's I think that it's funny. I mean, you know, sometimes people ask me what organizations. Sometimes I talk to Fortune 500 companies and things like that, and especially about sometimes the rise of Latinos in baseball and how things are changing and such like that. And people ask, okay, what teams are doing this really well? And we're talking kind of organizational type of stuff. And I go, it's not that tough. Just look at the standings, because they're usually the ones who've got the best coaches or the best apparatus to make sure their prospects especially succeed. Go ahead.
You touched on it just a moment ago with the Orioles losing 3 major ball players.
Yeah.
What is your prediction, or what why did they lose them, and B, what is your prediction for what they will do next year? And I'm sure it's money.
It's money. Maybe it goes back to ownership. I don't know.
Michael Morris.
Yeah. My prediction is I'm not quite sure yet, because I've sold them short before, and I've kind of overplayed this division before. And I'm terrible on the predicting. And I mean, my family makes fun of me half the time. Back when I was at USA Day, I had to make these predictions each year, and my daughter, my son, would hang on to them. And then by the end of the year, going, yeah, you said they were going to finish last, and they finished first. And it's like me trying to play, for a couple years I tried to play like fantasy baseball, rotisserie baseball. And my team would always be kind of down here someplace. And then finally somebody else looked at my roster and they said, well, your roster's terrible, but if you had to do a story and we were looking for good quotes, these would be great guys to talk to. I realized that's what I've been doing. Anyway, thank you all.
On behalf of the Brotherhood, we have a couple gifts for you. That's the standard one, but this is baseball, and I dug deep into my memorabilia, and you'll get a kick out of this one. This is actually a Cal Ripken free agent report from 1978, and I'll have to read one part. Summation: play shortstop, but lack of fluid mobility will limit prospect here. Live arm, excellent command of curveball, strong size, intense desire to play. Father's influence rate chance.
I think he had a pretty good chance.
And with that, there's a Cal Ripken card that's postmarked 2131 on September 6th, which is a little collector's item. And if you don't like Cal Ripken, sell it on eBay.
Thank you, Bill. Very good. Thank you much. Wow, very young there.
That was back when he first started. Still has some.